Well, Helen and I both really want to thank you, Tim, and Cassandra, and everybody here at Hillyer for having us. And we are very, very pleased to be here to talk about the exhibition. Helen has a comment about what day it is today.
World Refugee Day, you guys.
Oh.
Yeah.
Can you? No, and we did not plan it.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah. So
Even Tim did not plan it. But isn't that so meant to be?
it's just,
It
yeah,
is,
it's totally
it's meant to
be.
be. Thank you, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, so indeed.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to chat with Helen for a few minutes, and you take note of what we're saying, and if it causes you to think of something that you'd like to ask, sort of hang on to that until we're kind of done. Helen, this exhibition is titled, let's start with that, Borders and Barriers, Pattern of Resilience. It's a theme that you have explored for years now, actually. We will talk a lot about this more in depth, but first I'd like to delve a little bit into your past and talk to you about your artistic past and what got you here. Can you address two things? First, we know that you studied art at Syracuse University, and early on you developed this signature style, which I'm sure all of the people here who've seen your work before recognize. And you also use gouache, which is a notoriously difficult medium. How did that come about? And more importantly, how do you think the things you saw and lived with during your youth in Beirut affect your sensitivity to pattern in your work?
Those are good questions, and I will just say thank you to Tim and Cassandra and Abby and all of you for coming out on such a hot night. Thank you, and thank you, Dagmar. As Dagmar has been saying, the band is back together. So I'm very honored to be here. Yes, I got my Bachelor's of Fine Arts. Can everyone hear?
Yes.
Okay, good. From Syracuse University, and that is where I learned to use gouache. And very, very recently, I had a young collector come and bring an older piece of mine from 1991, signed with a different name, out with him. Yeah. Anyways, to repair it.
Ah.
And I am looking and trying to match the colors of gouache. It's an opaque watercolor, for those of you who don't know about gouache. It's an opaque watercolor. I mix my own colors, of course, and the way I like to use it is very flat, as you can see here. But a lot of artists, as Dagmar said, don't like to use it because it's very unforgiving. So you can't do over or make a mistake. And here I am, confronted with my painting from 1991, trying to redo the colors. It was really impossible. It was challenging. I also noticed that I've very much improved since 1995. Yeah, I told the sheriff, I'm like, phew, and he goes, doesn't that make you feel good? I said, yeah, it makes me feel really good. Yeah. And regarding your second part of that question, so for those of you who don't know, I was born in Lebanon, in Beirut. Daddy is from Syria, from Damascus, the old city. And at the time Daddy was born, there were no borders between Syria and Lebanon and Jordan and Palestine. It was under the French mandate. There were no borders then. So anyways, we also lived in Iraq and Kuwait and traveled around. So the color that I saw, the patterns that I saw, what we grow up with in the Middle East that we just subconsciously absorb. The textiles, and of course the Islamic patterning that was all around, it snuck in, and the combination of the gouache in the very particular way that I use lends itself to this kind of hard-edged, control of my work. And also I can say, the last thing about that is that in the chaos that I grew up in, considering the various wars and coups from Iraq, 2 wars in Lebanon, on my canvas or whatever it is, I could control my life a little bit, as opposed to what was going on around me, you know, because there was no control. Or you leave in one day, bye, you're gone. And so I was thinking a little bit more in depth about that question that you asked. So, you know.
Great. In one way or another, you've been telling the story of suffering and resilience of women and children for most of your artistic life, basically. Was there a particular moment in sort of a seminal turning point that led you to dedicate your work to this theme? And also, when did you start to transition from two-dimensional painting to adding installations? Was this also something that occurred when you reached that turning point?
I like your questions. They're like double questions in one. But I was just speaking with a guest here tonight about 9/11. And for Arab Americans living in, well, I was living here, that was a turning point for me. Because what we saw and what we faced as Arab Americans, Muslim, Christian, it was all conflated anyways. Nobody even thought there were Christian Arabs. But that negativity and the stereotyping and the sort of misunderstanding of who the Arabs were, for me, became a turning point for me in terms of telling our story. And whatever means I could do that, I was going to do that. I first tried to pretend I was Italian or Spanish. But then I thought, no, one of my journalist friends said, this is the time you should say you're Arab American. This is the time you need to explain yourself and who you are. And, you know, so that was a pivotal point, and entering, when we invaded Iraq as well, again, and talking about the women and what were the effects on the women and children in Iraq and Afghanistan. After we went in there in 2003 and 2005, I began focusing on them, because they're the ones that are left behind, primarily the women and the children. It's the men, they're either fighting, or they're dead, or they're gone. So it's the women and children that sort of carry on whatever is the family.
That was a real focusing, sort of laser focusing, because I recall one of the first pieces that you did after 9/11 was Prayer Rug for America, in which you created a prayer rug. So you can explain it a little bit about, but you used that facility in patterning to use the prayer rug motif, but to explain it in a way that centered you as an Arab American in the conversation that we were all having about who are Arabs and who are Americans and what is loyalty and what is all of these things. And you managed to encapsulate that in essentially the painting of an object, which I thought was very, very interesting.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that piece up, because that was a turning point for me. And you can see it at the Library of Congress. It belongs to you if you want to go see it. But it was in a big show called True Colors, Meditations on the American Spirit. And I, as an Arab American, I constantly feel this sort of push and pull between East and West in myself. And then I try and solve the problem in my paintings, whether or not I'm successful or not. But in that particular piece, it was a prayer rug, and I don't know if you've seen a prayer rug, but it's sort of like, I'm just gonna go like that. And of course, you take your shoes off before you enter to pray. And so the piece is not large, it's fairly small, little shoes in the corner, and my palette is red, white, and blue, echoing our United States flag. And so the motifs are both Islamic, but also refer to American flag and so on and so forth. And what I'm asking the viewer to do is enter to the painting, enter into that space of introspection instead of divisiveness, and to think about what had happened, you know, which was hard.
that leads me very much into the second half of that question, because in a sense, even though it was a painting, two-dimensional, it was almost an installation piece as well.
Huh.
And you told me the other day, we were talking about this, and how the reason that you've moved very much more into installations, in which you incorporate, obviously, your painting, is because the problem has become so large. Mm-hmm. Explain about the fact that there is a limit to the size of your paintings and how that affects you in terms of what you produce and why you produce installations.
Yeah, I really like that question. And after, I guess, the beginning of the Arab Spring, I would say that began in 2011. And then the subsequent war in Syria, which is ongoing. The massiveness of 13 million people leaving and dying, we can't wrap our heads around it. And it certainly doesn't fit on a two-dimensional surface. And so somehow things expanded. And so you see a few installations here that are, as you mentioned, ongoing. We could talk about that later. It almost seemed like the problem was so huge, it just could not be contained. And so because of my paintbrush, it's like have 3 hairs on it. And in general, the board that I use measures the maximum size 30 by 40. And I don't work like that. I work over a drawing board, so I'm actually like leaning over my work. And I'm physically limited by that. So then I decided I'll start making these little pieces, like a puzzle. That even the shoes and some other pieces that I've done that represent a larger issue, or what I want to say, that I can't actually like produce like a huge canvas, like some of those canvases in there, you know. Right. So, and I hope I answered that question.
That's a good transition. Mm-hmm. Now we'll turn to the exhibition, because I'm sure you're all very curious about what you're looking at on these particular walls. To start, I'm going to explore a subject that you and I have talked a lot about before, which is the concept of beauty. Uh-huh. And to start that, I want to discuss the Japanese concept of kintsugi by singling out one of the children's shoes in the piece, "Oh, the Places You'll Go," on the wall behind me. For those of you who don't know, kintsugi is the Japanese method of repairing broken objects with gold inlay. It embraces the flaws and the imperfections in order to create a stronger and more resilient piece. You have replicated the process in one of these small shoes. You can see it. I'm going to turn around.
Right by, yeah.
Right.
There you go.
Yeah, right here.
It might be sent before the first two.
Right.
Yeah, those.
I'm trying to, there it is.
Yeah.
There it is, there it is. Yes, it's about, there we go. And when you come up closer later, you'll be able to see these, because all of the divisions are there done. No, you can't touch them. See my little finger? Anyhow, you'll be able to see the use of that, in a sense, method. But that is one of the things that reminded me of our conversation about the use of beauty. And most people, when they see your work, that's the first comment they make. They say, "Oh my goodness, it's so beautiful." And then they start to read the captions, or they read your statements, and they begin to see the subject matter is very serious, sometimes very tragic, certainly mentally engaging in very, very many ways. You can't walk away from it without thinking about it. So talk a little bit about your concept, which we've talked about a lot, about your use of beauty and why using beauty to express these things is so important to you.
Yeah, I think that beauty is innate in people. I think that we respond to beauty. I remember overseas in Lebanon, passing some of the refugee camps, and I mean, not a great way to live, but planted flowers, tried to decorate the area, so on and so forth. The idea of beauty kind of wakes us up. And I feel, as far as I'm concerned, it is an easier way to access a heavier, hard subject. What I'm saying in here, in this room that we're sitting in, is really sad. It's sad in so many ways. Though there's hope and there's optimism. The beauty is reflected in the color pattern. But I think that the way that I try and get my message across is by making something enough, I don't know how to use, not attractive, not beautiful, so at least you're going to look at it or respond to it on that innate level. And after you look at it, then you can read my statement or you can read my title and you can really think about what I'm saying. Yeah. I mean, I'll just bring up this anecdote. Some of you may have heard it in another talk, but I was at the Jerusalem Fund. We were in a panel with the German photographers. Yes. Do you remember that? We had 2 German photographers from Berlin who took pictures of Syrian refugees. Children. Massive, like almost life-size portraits.
Yes.
Remember those?
Yeah.
And one of the photographers, he took his photos like these could be your kids. They were smiling. They were
dancing,
playing pranks, and so on and so forth. Whereas the other, it was difficult. I looked at one, and he's already preaching to the choir. I could not look. It was amputated, and he had a series of them, and I just couldn't look anymore. In the middle of our conversation in the panel, if you recollect, I've never forgotten this. He asked, when he was speaking, he asked the audience, like here, if anyone knows where I can exhibit my photographs, please let me know. And I thought, wow, he's an incredible photographer. He's working on important subjects that we need to know about. But who's looking? No one's looking. So
that's the thing
getting his message
we've been
across?
talking about that. Yeah. We have this little saying between the two of us. If you don't look, you cannot see. And the idea is you need first to look at it. You have to want to look at it. And once you've done that, you can then begin to see the message that the artist is trying to tell you.
Yeah, it's subversive a little bit.
Yeah, it is. It should draw you in. It should seduce you in a way. Mm-hmm. And after that, you then can start to think about what the artist's message is. But if you don't want to look at it, it is very, very difficult. And this is kind of counterintuitive because if you've looked at a lot of art, especially contemporary art, there is a certain standard of what I like to call uglification of art. Uglification of art that seems to be very modern, very contemporary, and the feeling that art must be very hard-hitting in order to get its message across. I think it's a very difficult thing to do well. I think some people really do it well, but I tend to fall into the beauty camp a little bit more.
Well, thanks for falling into the camp, but with regards to the shoes, which we didn't talk about, which is what brought up the Japanese, I don't know how to say that word.
Kintsugi.
Yeah. So I don't know if you remember the port explosion in Lebanon, So what happened, if you weren't killed or whatever, you were injured in terms of all the glass flying and shattered glass. And a lot of my cousins even, but were a lot of plastic surgery going like on their faces and so on and so forth. So this piece also too is ongoing. And so I did my shattered shoes, the 2 shoes there with the little gold gouache in terms, and that's what they also used as well. They picked up the debris, they incorporated a stitch, like you're having stitch when your face is getting back together. They used it in materials. It was so incredibly imaginative and healing. They incorporated it into this covering of furniture, the stitch, like how you get a stitching like that. Yeah, it was really amazing. So referencing that.
We can segue into the shoes, and let me sort of preface that in a sense by saying, when you see the shoes and when you see the portraiture that is on the wall to my right, you have, and people will notice, there's symbolic patterning, which is your signature, in each of these works and also on the shoes. But you have widened your focus quite a bit since some of your earlier exhibitions to include people from the Middle East, but also bringing it out from, in this case, Haiti, as well as Syria, and other parts of the world, including Mexico and Africa and Ukraine. And if you start to look at the patterns on the shoes, you'll begin to see some hints of that in terms of the colors that were chosen and sometimes even the motifs that were chosen. So tell me a little bit about the fact that about your widening of your focus and including the elements of the refugee situation, the climate change, all of these things that seem to have sort of piled one on top of the other as you were expanding what you were doing.
Yeah, well, I mean, say the shoes began in 2015 because I really was viscerally thinking about the little kids crossing the border into Turkey. And I was thinking and I heard that photographer that we were talking about, when he saw a couple of shoes that we had on exhibit, he remembered one little girl who had, I mean, I don't have kids, but you know those light up shoes, those shoes that little children wear thing? And he said, I wish I could take some of your shoes back to her. She was crossing the border, it was at nighttime, and they made her take up, so she lost her little light up shoes. But the significance of the shoes, if you think about it, they do two things. They make you run away from danger for sure and run to your dreams. And so that's what I was thinking about in this piece. And I am taking off, oh, the places they'll go, all the places you'll go. No, all the places they'll go. I was taking off on Dr. Seuss, oh, the places you'll go, indicating you have all your dreams ahead of you. So I'm asking the viewer to rethink what these children are going through and so on and so forth. So this piece, and as Dagmar said, when Ukraine happened and subsequent, Sudan, Haiti, these patterns, these shoes are, I don't know what that says about humanity, but yeah, and it's all the same. Whether it's Syria, where I began in my focus, but you look at our border here, you talk about Haiti, you talk about Sudan, that piece over there, it's the mother and the daughter who were caught in the barbed wire and the Rio Grande that were killed trying to cross to come to America. So, as you said, and the reason is because it's basic humanity. You know, it doesn't matter if you're talking about Syria or our border or Haiti. You know, the effects are the same on the people and so on. Yeah. And much of the reasoning is the same of why, you know, no one's leaving just because they want to leave.
Precisely.
Precisely, yeah.
Now, let's turn our focus to the two wall pieces. That one is in the back of the room, and one you'll see over here on the left-hand side. I want to talk about the titles, which is very important. Helen and I have talked a lot about the fact that she titles her work. You see a lot of people who just write, you know, #1 or untitled or whatever. But for Helen, titles are very important. And this will give you a really good reason why. So the piece that you see, the smaller piece over here, is called Another Brick in the Wall. The piece that you see on the back wall is called The Wall of Resilience. Talk a little bit about each piece separately and tell us what the title means and why you chose to depict basically two walls in such very different ways.
Yeah. So in this piece, this is a bit earlier, and as
ongoing.
It's ongoing. It's ongoing. So here you see my use of patterning, but also collage. And when I began this piece, with that massive movement of, in a very quick time, a very short time, of 13 million Syrians trying to find safety, it was they've never had an influx like that in any crisis before, you know. So countries, some were receptive and some were not very receptive, and there were anti-refugee protests and so on, borders closed to them. So if you look closely at that piece, you'll see some of my nods to that. You'll also see the use of the sea and trying to leave by sea. And yeah, and the patterning, which is also consistent with embroidery and patterns that tell a story as well. And you know, one of the things that I think is important, say take that wall of resilience, you know, it's like quilting. I went to see that show. Yeah. And it's passed down from generation to generation, primarily from mother to daughter. And in the part of the world that I come from, a traditional dress, or just even a regular dress, called thobe, Daddy called thobe, and it's embroidered so that I know that, say, you're from Annapolis or you're from Fairfax. I know because of the little stitching, it tells a story, what you're wearing, and you know that I'm coming from Washington, D.C. likewise. And I just love that idea. It's taken from the environment. For me, the color, the pattern, that idea of generation to generation, of keeping their families and their traditions alive, their culture alive, is a sign of resilience. It's a sign of strength. It's a sign of pride and dignity, which I think are also very important to me in terms of talking about these issues that, you know, I don't know when we want to talk about that, but talk about hitting you over the head. Yes. But there's a pedestal right there that says, look up. And of course, so I'm obviously making a reference to people that look down on refugees, but I also want to say, which is in keeping with what we're talking about, and specifically this show, is that these people, I say these people, who were they before they had to flee their country? Right? I mean, let's face it, they were doctors, they were lawyers, they were farmers, they had family, they had school, they were barbers, they were grocers. They had a life. What I want to also do here is to say that it's not the only identity. That is not only the identity. It's right now, but it's not who they are.
Exactly.
Yeah. I know I didn't answer your question.
No, you did, exactly. You did quite well. But
I really want to talk about that piece too. So.
I know. But we can go back to this concept in that, in many ways, the piece that is the wall of resilience is, in a sense, even a much more hopeful piece, even though it's the creation of a wall. And you think of a wall as you know, a barrier of keeping people out. But in this particular case, what they're showcasing in the designs is this concept of building a wall of culture, building a wall of all of the things that refugees bring to a place, not the things that they're escaping from, but the things that they're able to bring to the new place if only we would let them. Whereas another brick in the wall, which of course comes from a musical lyric, also implies this is an ongoing crisis. This is yet another bad thing that's happening. Yet another brick in the wall that we have to talk about, that we have to show, that we have to explain, that we have to showcase for people to understand that this is not stopping. This is just going on. And the way you've created the piece, where we can continuously add another piece, another brick, as the situation goes.
We'd rather not.
But we'd rather not.
We'd rather not.
You've left yourself open in many ways for both the difficulties and adding to the positive in the wall of resilience. Which kind of leads me to my last question. One little comment I want to make, because you were talking about dignity, because we haven't talked very much about the women who are left behind, which is that painting.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about that. And Cedra.
The concept of dignity is very important in the way you paint. And I'm going to talk about that at the very end, in the very, very last question, in about 1 minute, to talk about the fact that you have another body of work that we want to introduce people to if they don't already know about it, since we happen to be next door to the Phillips. But the idea of the way you paint people is you give them a great degree of dignity. These are supposed to be refugees. These, are these people who, we see on the newsreels, who are fleeing, who are mud covered, who are in boats, drowning. It's very difficult to look at. You dress them in dignity. Talk a little bit about that, and also Cedra.
Yeah. So this piece is called Left Behind, and if you look closely, I won't give it away, but there is somebody who's facing the viewer. It's another way I do what I use to employ for you to actually look, to be able to focus, like the shoes. We keep saying how big everything is, how we can't wrap our heads around it. But if you focus on a little shoe, or you focus on a pattern, or you focus on a brick, it's bringing that intimacy to you, where you can be able to absorb it. And so I won't say, but in there, so one of the ramifications, I call it left behind. As I said earlier, who in general is left behind? The women. They're the ones that have to look after their family, find shelter, find food, find clean water. And in many cases, they're now the head of family. So they have to, whereas they may have not ever worked outside the home or outside the tent, now they have to do that. And so it's a new position. As a result of displacement or IDP or war situation, what happens is that in general, the women and the girls are the most vulnerable. They face sexual violence, and a huge, massive problem is child marriage. I mean, as young as 7. And if you think about that, you're cutting off education. The cycle of horribleness is just imbued in that. And basically all it is there was an incredible article in the Washington Post some months ago about how much a little girl, different families who had sold their girls, I don't know if you saw that, into child marriage. One child that could feed the family for a year, the little girl. I mean, that's reality.
Sure. They
didn't want to do it, but how desperate is that? So in this piece, with the color, with the pattern, it's what I'm referring to with the young girls and the other whole end of what happens when you have a war.
But the interesting thing about that painting, and it reminds me of another painting of very similar nature that you did for another show we did together, is that there's also, even in this, a feeling of resilience in the sense that they are massed together, that they are supporting each other. When you look at the way you painted it, they're physically supporting each other. Their shoulders are next to each other. Their heads are next to each other. They're all, whether they're
solidarity.
There's real solidarity in that.
Yeah.
And so it, in a sense, to me, it really has a double message in the power of women to help each other
Of course,
and
right.
support each other in situations when they're the only ones who are able to do it. They're the
Yeah.
only ones who are able to feed their families
Yeah.
under those circumstances. But that kind of resilience brings us to Cedra.
Yeah.
So,
Cedra. So I was invited to Turkey, to Istanbul. It was before the earthquake. And I did a workshop where with Syrian refugee young people, both boys and girls. And I brought shoes, and they painted their, as I said, the duality of what a shoe is. They painted their hopes, and they also painted sort of like their fears. And it was very interesting, and then they had to write a story about what they were and the symbols that they used. And this little young girl, Cedra, I took that picture. She was showing me her fitted shoes. And you can see the one in the, whatever hand that is, a little more gloomy and so on and so forth, and the other one with sort of those childlike rainbowy colors and so on and so forth. She wants to study architecture. She's from Damascus, and she wants to study architecture to be like Zaha Hadid, the incredible architect who's no longer here, but to go back and rebuild, help rebuild Damascus, which is pretty amazing. The painting of a stitch, of the embroidery stitch behind, it's my gouache, but it is inspired by a stitch called The Road to Damascus. And I couldn't even make that up. So it's kind of like a ladder and her trajectory. And then we painted the shoes. It was funny to do someone else's design on my yeah. So we brought them to real life as if we are actually asking her to come out of that painting and go for it, you know. Anyways, and I got her permission to be here. She's very excited.
very excited.
Mm-hmm.
So we're coming to the conclusion of our talk. I just want to ask you a little bit about what the future holds for you, and also to introduce these wonderful people to another project that is also ongoing in your life that is not currently being exhibited, but probably can be seen on your website also.
Yeah.
Just talk a little bit quickly about that project and any plans you have for the future.
So what the series that Dagmar is referring to is my Syrian migration series, based on Jacob Lawrence, and I know a lot of friends here know about that work, but if you haven't, go to the Phillips. There are 30 of his migration series. And I was invited to a residency in 2015 in the height of the war in Syria. I was limited by my transportation on public metro bus of what I could carry. And I started thinking about the parallels between Jacob Lawrence's migration series and what was happening to the Syrians. And it seems incongruous. And he painted them in 1940 or 41. They were fleeing Jim Crow, segregation, violence, a war of a different kind. Fleeing to a better place to try and find a life and a better situation for their family. Basically the same thing. And so I began a series. We now have 52. I'm not trying to emulate his in that 60, but I'm up to 52. As things happen, I work on a new piece. And I will just say this, and it harkens back to what we said earlier about the ongoingness. The ongoingness, if that's even a word, of work, of people. That number 60, he painted in 1941 of his migration series. And his little narrative there was, and the migrants keep coming. Here we are. I did the calculator before I came here. It's like 84 years. From that time to now.
And the migrants keep coming.
Look at what's this show.
Yeah.
You know, it's really completely crazy. That's why I like animals. Honestly, I swear. But I mean, it makes you think.
Yes,
You know,
it
do we learn from the past, or do we just sort of? I don't know. It's a question that I wrestle with. So. Yeah.
So tell us some of the questions you're wrestling with at the moment.
I have a question actually about this painting there, and where those women, or if they're a family, are from, and kind of, you know, it's a striking difference between the colors and the background and them in black and white. And when I've seen that piece, I've been really curious about it.
Okay, thank you so much for bringing that up. That's very new, and those women are probably circa 1900 from Ramallah. And you can see in their dress and so on and so forth, but they're sitting around having coffee and embroidering. And then I added my own paint on there, but if you look closely, they're embroidering. They would be women gathered just like any other group of women. The other parts, what they're sitting in, was inspired by some recent images that I've seen of people's homes that have been destroyed, but then you see them sitting like on a chair outside their home. I've seen this in many, many different conflicts, and in Lebanon, in Syria, Palestine. And so that is my juxtaposition there. And the painting, I say painted stitches behind, are very particular. The bottom, moving from the down to the top, is you have the wall, the wall of the old city wall of Jerusalem. Then you have I have a ladder. Then the cypress trees, the ladder, the rose, and they would have been painting also. Doing the stitches. What's around them? The pigeons and the Star of Bethlehem. And so that is, don't even ask me how long it took. Anyways, long time. That's about the largest that I can work. That's about 30 by 40. But thank you for asking that. But there again, it's resilience. You know, it's people in the face of hell, trying to get through the day, I guess. I don't know how to say it. We're lucky here, you know.
And then they're black and white, but they're actually blue.
I painted over it, yeah. So I wanted to animate them and bring them, and it's just like an artistic kind of thing to do, but point up what they're doing. They're sipping coffee or so on, or definitely embroidering. My grandmother, Teta, my father's mother, in Syria, they would hold court in old outside of their home. As I said, he was in the old city, so they have courtyards with a well that keeps the fresh air and so on. And the same women would come every day at 11, and they would make the coffee on the brazier and smoke the hubbly bubbly, the shisha, all the women. And Daddy was not permitted to be there. And they would do a communal thing like picking beans or vegetables, talk about the same things every day, the same things. You know, whatever, someone was bad, whatever troubles were outside, but this kind of gathering, you know, just typical. Yeah, thank you for asking about that painting. Thank you. No, I can't go there, of course, but I was invited by the State Department in 2008. That was my first time to go to Palestine. And I was in East Jerusalem. I was working with the occupied territories, and we were working with women from the West Bank on an exhibition supported by State Department. And I was there for about a month, and our workshop was in Ramallah, where this photograph is. And it was very interesting. I wasn't permitted to go to Gaza, and I had to be out of the West Bank every day by 3 o'clock. And so it was a fascinating experience. It's one that will never leave me. And so with regards to your question, it's heartbreaking all around. Yeah. And yeah, it's incredibly heartbreaking. everywhere you look at it, you know. So, you know, I was listening to a Zoom the other day, and basically they're like, okay, well, how do we stop this? How do we, you know, because we could talk and we could say you feel bad, and then you go out for dinner and have a glass of wine and you kind of forget about it, right? It's easy. Just don't make a war. Men in here. Don't do a war. We don't start the war. But I mean, just don't do that. Then we won't have these problems. Then we can have flowers and birds. Well, at this point, that's the most comfortable medium for me. But really, like, I feel like I can control it. I really, really do. And the way that I use it is very opaquely, as opposed to you're an artist, as opposed to like a watercolory kind of way. So I like that I can actually control it. And I like, the colors to me are, I mean, I mix my own colors, but they're so vibrant and beautiful, and I love the richness of the colors. So that, I really like it. I like it. Yeah, yeah. It's like the icing part when I start to work. I hate the composition. I hate the beginning sketching and all that. And it's like eating icing off the cupcake when you get to the painting part. Yeah, yeah. Thank you.
I'd like to come back to the notion of a wall being a barrier between essentially two worlds, but also once you are over the wall protects your culture and gives you an opportunity to actually expand. And, you know, not being from this country, but I've been living here for a long time, I'm more and more amazed how actually all the communities that I interact with in the United States build their own protective walls to some extent to maintain their culture.
Right.
But then the next step for me is that because of this juxtaposition, at times intercommunications between cultures, then you create a new culture. And I was wondering whether, you know, at some points you could take the walls down.
Well, I mean, that's fantastic. I mean, I think it's sort of what you said as well. And you know, we all come from somewhere else, and we all bring those treasures with us inside, even if we can't carry it in our suitcase. But we do bring what we think is important or what we've absorbed into a new life. I mean, I know, I certainly know that my family did it, my dad did it, and I wasn't born here, but we all did, of course you did it, but I think, I don't know, my wall is open. There is a door to go through my wall. I don't want barriers. I don't want to shut out. I want, what I want is, I want a bridge. You know, I want that culture, this culture, that world, this world, to, it sounds like a Pollyanna, but I want them to be at least respectful of one another, and at least try and understand one another.
So that sounds like a perfect,
door in the wall.
a perfect way of thinking about forthcoming shows. Move on to bridges.
To bridge.
We want to thank you very much for coming and we really want to thank Helen. Thank Helen so much for her amazing, inspiring work.
Thank you, thank you.
It makes